Please give your perspective on why polyamory is bad for the individual and society. Well, I think the fundamental reason is, there's a bunch of reasons. I mean, the first is societies seem to function better, that is, less violently, let's say, when there's one woman per man. If there's many women per man, there aren't many women for every man. There are a handful of men, let's say a minority of men, a Pareto distribution of men who have a disproportionate number of women, and a lot of men who have none. And those aren't happy men, let's put it that way. They're men who are very likely to get up to no good very rapidly. So there's that. Then I would say the women who, let's say a man has many women, and let's say he's a desirable man for that matter, just for the sake of argument, if he has a variety of women, then those women don't have much of him. So they don't get to establish a real individual relationship with him because it's going to be fragmentary. And I don't believe that that's satisfying for people. I think that what you want, as much as you possibly can, is to have people around you with whom you can weave your life together over the short term, medium term, and long term. It adds depth to your life in a way that almost nothing else can. And so what you do, and so I've been speaking more about permanent polyamorous relationships. You might ask, well, what about sequential ones where, which is in some ways indiscriminable from, from just casual sleeping around. I think the problem with that is that to sleep around casually is to imply that sex is casual. To imply that sex is casual is to assume implicitly that it can be divorced from the rest of life, emotional life, motivational life, values, all of that. And you can divorce it, but you pay a big price for that. I think the price you pay is like the virtual. Well, the word psychopathic keeps leaping to mind. Yeah, good old Freud. You have to reduce a person to the casual pleasure of a transient sexual interaction in order to sleep around casually. And I think that once you establish that as a habit with sex, which is a deep experience, if you'll do that with sex, which is a deep experience, then, and you learn how, then what makes you think that won't transfer to everything else that you do? I don't see how it can fail to. So, you could say, well, monogamy isn't a very good solution. It's like, well, life is a sexually transmitted disease with a 100% fatality rate too. There's lots of really complex problems for which we only have the best answer we can come up with, which is not a utopian answer, but I would say, and I think the evidence supports this as well, that stable monogamy is the best solution that we know of, and it's also the minimum necessary requirement for the stability of children. So, polyamory, it's wrong. It's wrong. It makes men violent. It increases inequality in the manner that makes things dangerous. It makes it impossible for women to have a deep relationship with men. It facilitates the, the transformation of sex into something casual, and then that spills out into the rest of the world. It deprives the people who engage in it of the opportunity of establishing a stable, long-term, mutually satisfying. It's more than that. Mutually beneficial relationship. Because a good marriage, the people in it gain more than they're more than twice as good, right? The benefits aren't precisely linear, so you lose that. It destabilizes the situation for children. There you go, man. That's a lot of things that aren't about it that aren't good. That's for sure. What is my opinion on open relationships, polyamory, other forms of non-monogamy? Well, I think that as a medium to long-term strategy, they're completely untenable, because human beings, as far as I'm concerned, are fundamentally pair bonding. And, if you're just talking about casual sex, first of all, I think casual sex is a contradiction in terms. I don't think there's anything about sex that's casual, and I think that people are deceiving themselves badly whenever they think so. They might like to live in a 1970s Playboy adolescent fantasy, but I've never seen that work under any circumstances whatsoever, and I think people get hurt badly. It's also a bad medium to long-term strategy, because pair bonding is the most stable arrangement we know of, at least so far. Well, I won't even put it that way. It's the only stable mode of being that we know for the long run, and that's especially the case when you bring children into the equation. So I think it's delusional fundamentally, and I think that people who believe that such things work, I mean, sometimes they're open people and they're creative and they're exploratory and all of that, and fair enough, but often they're just unconscientious and they don't want to take any responsibility, and they want to live in this wish fulfillment fantasy where everybody can have all the sex they want all the time, and it's always wonderful and no one gets hurt. And it's like, sorry, that just doesn't work in the real world.
By Michael Sonmore, published on July 16, 2015, What Open Marriage Taught One Man About Feminism. And I'll just read it and you decide what you want to think of it. As I write this, my children are asleep in their room. Loretta Lynn is on the stereo, and my wife is out on a date with a man named Paulo. I'm an economically dependent house husband, coping with the withering drudgery of child rearing. Now that I understand the reality of that situation, I don't blame women for demanding more for themselves than the life of the housewife. In this way, my masculine self-image was stretched but not broken. Diaper bag notwithstanding, I was still a man, capitalized. It wasn't until my wife mentioned one evening that she'd kissed another man and liked it and wanted to do more than kiss next time that I realized how my status as a man, capitalized, depended on a single fact, that my wife fucked only me. When people ask how it started, I say this: we married young. She'd had sex before me, but only with a handful of people, a handful of times. She never had a boyfriend, never had a lover. I was the first man she ever had the chance to get to know intimately. By her mid-30s, having already had our children and entering her sexual prime, she felt keenly her lack of sexual experience. Happily for me, she was willing to talk about it, willing to ask if I'd be open to exploring other options. We opened a bottle of wine and started talking and talking and talking. And this guy's really, what a man. She didn't present it as an issue of feminism to me, but after much soul-searching about why the idea of my wife having sex with other men bothered me, I came to a few conclusions. Monogamy meant I controlled her sexual expression, and not to get all women's studies major about it, patriarchal oppression essentially boils down to a man's fear that a woman with sexual agency is a woman he can't control. Well, you're partly right in that men have devised all sorts of cultural and religious means to control women's sexuality. That is absolutely right. I've written about it in my evolutionary work. I've lectured about it. But they do it for one evolutionary reason, and that is because of paternity uncertainty. Humans are a biparental species. We need to invest heavily in our children. Both parents do. And therefore, it doesn't make sense for a heavily invested biparental species to have the sex that does have genetic uncertainty, which is men, to not care about not being cuckolded. So the reason why men care about being cuckolded is not because they suffer from toxic masculinity and need Gillette ad therapy. It's because you and I, and most of the people watching, all of the people watching this clip, come from ancestors where the men cared greatly about not being cuckolded by the women with whom they're forming long-term pair bonds. The point is that it should be women who choose, not men, even the men they're married to. As a matter of fact, women do choose. Sexual selection in most species is driven by female mate choice. So we didn't need this feminist male to tell us that. It's the defining feature of the evolutionary trajectory of countless species. All right, let's go on. For my wife, the choice between honoring our vows and fulfilling her desires was a false choice, another trap. She knew how deep our love was and knew that her wanting a variety of sexual experiences as we traveled through life together would not diminish or disrupt that love. It took me about 6 months, many long, intense conversations, and an ocean of red wine before I knew it too. When my wife told me she wanted to open our marriage and take other lovers, she wasn't rejecting me. She was embracing herself. When I understood that, I finally became a feminist. Sorry, I'm choked up. This is very moving. That was 2 years ago, and today we've never been happier, more in tune, closer, tighter, stronger. Whatever power I surrendered, I don't miss. I wouldn't recommend it for everyone, but I tell everyone it works for us. And I should mention, live and let live. If this works for them, that's fine. But it's the Gillette ad tone that I take issue with. How does it work? We take turns going out. We have small children, age 6 and 3. One of us stays home. We don't like to use babysitters because it gives us a curfew. We'd rather go out unfettered than worry about turning into a pumpkin at midnight. Going out alone to hooking up with others was an easy transition. It does work both ways. And yes, I too enjoy sexual carte blanche. I just don't use mine as much as my wife uses hers. Of course you don't. What's important is equality of opportunity, not outcome. What surprises most people is when I tell them that it's not the sex with other men that bothers me. Pay attention here because I'm going to break out the evolutionary theory in a second. The sex is the easy part, the fun part. It's what the sex connects to, stands for, reveals that can be difficult. I don't want her to fall in love with anyone else, and every time she goes on a date, I confront the possibility that she might. It happened at the beginning. The first person she dated after we opened up fell hard in love with her, and my wife, overwhelmed by his ardor, tried to love him back. Watching it happen, I was confused, angry, and terrified that she wanted to leave me. She assured me she didn't, and whatever feelings she had for me didn't lessen what she felt for me. Believing her then was the ultimate trust exercise. We survived because eventually I did believe her, and also because I learned to trust myself. Let me summarize here something that is profoundly important, something that I've discussed in the past. There are studies by my good friend David Buss and other colleagues looking at the evolutionary roots of romantic jealousy. And the idea is that it's not that men or women are more jealous in a romantic context. It's that the triggers of jealousy are different. Men are much more triggered by sexual infidelity, whereas women are a lot more triggered by emotional infidelity. In other words, if you ask men to imagine their partners either engaging in sexual or emotional infidelity. Emotional infidelity here means that you form a tight emotional bond with no sex, versus sexual infidelity would be, say, you have sex with someone else, but there is no bond. Men respond much more adversely if they imagine their woman having sex with another man. Women, on the other hand, have a greater stress response to emotional infidelity. And the evolutionary reasons are very simple. For men, the greatest threat to their evolutionary interests is to be cuckolded. Therefore, they've evolved the cognitive, the emotional, the behavioral systems to try to thwart that particular evolutionary threat. They don't tolerate sharing of their women sexually. Not because of toxic masculinity, not because of the patriarchy, because of this little thing called biology. Women, on the other hand, while of course they're not happy with sexual infidelity of their partners, emotional infidelity is a greater predictor of a man leaving the union. Therefore, they respond even more harshly to emotional infidelity. Well, this guy's response is exactly that of a woman. Not only when given the choice to have a quote hall pass, he uses it less than his wife, which itself is not the typical pattern that you would see, but the pattern of sexual versus emotional infidelity that he experiences is exactly that of typical of a woman. So sure, he's a man, but he's a very feminine man.
I'm not yet convinced that I want to be polyamorous. But
Not yet.
Jeffrey's only had an hour to work his magic on me.
Strangely enough, it was reading Sam's book on lying that was a spark towards polyamory. In this sense that I realized most marriages are founded on continual low-level lying about a lot of aspects of our fantasy lives and our sexual desires and our flirtations and our frustrations, and it is extremely hard for pair-bonded people to be truly open and entirely honest with each other if they don't broaden the context of their relationship a little bit. That's probably not true for everybody, but I think it's true for a lot of people. And to me, one of the key attractions of polyamory was precisely that I can imagine this would be a much more open, honest, ethical, upfront way to live than the typical monogamous marriage.
That's interesting. Yeah, so I think, I can go all the way. I can sort of run polyamory and emulation there because I understand that jealousy is something you want to get over. Jealousy doesn't make sense in that you are ostensibly committed to the happiness of this other person. In fact, this is the person you most want to be happy in the world, if this is the person you love most in the world. And the idea that something that would make this person happy is something that absolutely horrifies you, there's some cognitive and emotional algebra to do there to understand what's going on. And I can certainly see this, again, the hassle factor here seems pretty high, at least as I imagine what it would be like to live this way. But if I imagine, I have some terminal illness and I have to envision what my wife's life is going to be like after I die, well, of course I want her to be in a fulfilling relationship. And I want all of that stuff to happen. And that's not something that I would be thinking about. Jealousy would clearly not apply in that circumstance. And so, but I'm not dead yet. Here.